Just a minute. Okay, so we are live on YouTube, so we can get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on power system decarbonization and modernization challenges and opportunities in Brazil and the United States. My name is Josué Prado. I am a system professor at Washington State University. And today I have the honor to introduce you to two very special guests, Dr. Luis Barroso. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about your bio. He's the CEO of PSR Energy Consulting and Analytics, which is a global electricity and gas consulting company based in Brazil. So from 2018 to 2020, he was the president of the Brazilian Energy Research Office, EPE, which is a government company connected to the Ministry of Energy and Mines in Brazil. Dr. Barroso is a fellow of the IEEE and has contributed a lot in the area of power systems and energy policy and planning. And I also have the privilege of introducing Dr. Julio Romero Aguero, which is Senior Vice President of Quanta Technology in the strategic and business innovation area. He has more than 28 years of experience providing leadership to Quanta Technology in the areas of technology, strategy, innovation, grid modernization, distributed systems planning, reliability, resilience, and grid integration of distributed energy resources. Dr. Aguero is a senior member of the IEEE and is actively involved in many IEEE activities. So I want to thank you both for accepting this invitation to join this webinar. And I think we can get started. We can talk a little bit about yourselves, what you do, and also your company too. So we can start with Luis.
Yes, so hello everyone, and hello Josh and Julio. It's great to be with you. It's always great to be with interesting people and clever friends. So I think you spoke quite well about my background. So just in addition to what you have said, my background is mathematics, and I'm a mathematician by nature, but I have been working on power system and energy planning for all my career. And I have strong connections with the universities as well. So I supervise a bunch of masters and PhDs theses. And I would say that my career has spanned over where policy, planning, markets, and risk management overlap. So I cover a little bit of everything. And the PSR is a Brazilian firm. We're a consulting firm, very much into modeling. And we are the developers of the stochastic dual dynamic programming methodology and model, which is globally used. And we are very active all over the world. We work in 70 different countries. In the US, we're very active in the Pacific Northwest. So we are the developers of the Genesis 2 model, which is a model to schedule the hydro plants in the Pacific Northwest. And we've done a lot of reliability studies there as well. But I'll stop here because otherwise I can go on just talking about me and PSR forever. Let's get to the business.
Sounds good. Thank you, Luis. Julio.
First of all, thank you, Josué, for organizing this event. It's a pleasure to be here. Luis and I, we served together as editors, associate editors of IEEE transactions on Smart Grid a few years ago under Professor Mohammed Shahidapur. So it's great to reconnect with Luis. Well, Quanta Technology is a wholly owned subsidiary of Quanta Services. Quanta Technology was founded in 2006, and our core business is to help electric utilities with some of the challenges that we are going to discuss today: the energy transition, decarbonization, grid modernization, etc. So at our core, we are a consulting firm. We provide specialized services for electric utilities. We also provide testing services of advanced technologies. We have two laboratories, one in Toronto, Canada, and another one in Raleigh, North Carolina, where we test smart inverters, advanced protection systems, etc. We also have developed some hardware solutions. Recently we founded a spin-off of Quanta Technology. The name of the company is Innoversa. That is a provider. It has developed solutions to provide mobile energy storage solutions to electric utilities. And we also develop software in partnership with key clients. It's not something that we do. We are not a software company, but we do that strategically when we have to develop solutions as part of projects with our clients. We are headquartered in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we have offices, two offices in California, another one in Chicago, another one in Toronto. And then Quanta Services, it's the largest specialized services provider for the utility industry, oil and gas and electric industry in North America. And it's headquartered in Houston. I live in Houston as well. It's a Fortune 200 company, very large firm. So we are the consulting division of Quanta Services.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah. And just for the audience watching us, feel free to ask questions. We're going to talk about some topics related to decarbonization and basically decarbonization and grid modernization. So feel free to put your questions in the chat so we can read at the end. So let's start talking about decarbonization. Okay. So, and we can start talking about the US. So I got some data from last year, and in 2022, about 60% of the electricity generation in the US was from fossil fuels, including coal, natural gas, petroleum, and other fuels. This data is from the US Energy Information Administration. So my question to Julio is, Julio, 60% of the electricity is from fossil fuels. What are the main challenges to decarbonize the US power grid?
Thank you for the question, and let me give you my perspective. Right, I think that there are a few. Some of them are technical, and some of them are not necessarily technical. Let's call them non-technical. Let me start with the non-technical ones, or well, let me start with technical. Actually, let's do it that way. So, as we know, many states in North America, and remember that in the US we have a federal system, in Brazil as well. So every state in the US is like a small country in terms of they define their own policy, energy policy. They have their own regulatory boards. So utilities have to follow instructions from those regulatory boards, distribution utilities. And of course, on top of that, we have FERC, which regulates interstate commerce. So many states have established renewable portfolio standards or clean energy standards, and they have established goals that they want to achieve. Generally, it's in the 2040 decade, 2040, 45, 2050. Usually around that time, they want to achieve 100% electricity production from renewables or from clean energy. And the definition of clean energy is very important. In some states, well, clean energy includes, for instance, natural gas. In other states, it does not include natural gas. So technical challenges. What we have to do in the next 20 or 30 years is in reality something that we haven't done as an industry before. We have never operated systems as large as Brazil's or the US using mainly inverter-based technologies. We are talking about adopting solar, adopting wind, and in some areas of the country, it represents already fair amount or the majority of the resources that are available, and most importantly, the majority of the resources that are being interconnected. So from a technical standpoint, we need to develop new knowledge. Besides that, we also need, we are still going to need firm generation technologies. We are still going to need synchronous machines, right? We are going to need modular nuclear generation is one of those technologies that are very promising. We are going to need hydrogen. We are going to need long duration energy storage. There is no cost-effective long duration energy storage technology at this point. And by long duration, I mean multi-day type of solutions, right? Generally, what we use are battery energy storage systems, lithium ion mainly. So, so on the technical side, there is plenty to do. And then operations planning, all of that, again, has to be revisited and I would say redesigned around that 100% either renewables or clean energy. So that's technical. Then on the non-technical side of things, we have a talent shortage, right? We don't have enough folks entering our industry for the amount of investments that we are going to need over the next 20 or 30 years to deploy those assets in the field, to do the necessary engineering studies and so on and so forth. So that's another key concern. So we need to recruit more people. We need to go beyond, traditionally, I'm glad that, Luis mentioned that he's a mathematician, and that demonstrates that we need to go beyond the traditional professions that historically have been the core of our industry, like electrical engineers. We need to look at people like Luis, right? Mathematicians, people with majors in physics, anything that is STEM, I would say, science, technology, and other engineering disciplines, civil, industrial, etc. So that's a non-technical challenge. And then the final one that is very important too, at least in the short midterm, is supply chain. There is a big problem right now with, and it's a consequence of the pandemic, but it's also a consequence to some extent of the limited resources that we have. Going back to lithium ion, if we want to deploy energy storage and if we want to deploy electric vehicles, we need a lot of lithium. And it is not an unlimited resource, right? So that's another concern. And then the supply chain has been disrupted by the pandemic. And right now, if you want to build a new transmission line, a new substation, if you want to deploy new power transformers, you may need to wait, for months or years in some cases. So that's another situation that we have to manage.
Very, very interesting. So how about transmission capacity? So the other day I was attending a presentation by Bonneville Power Administration, very close here to Vancouver, Washington. And they were talking about the huge potential of offshore wind, on this side of the country, So there's a lot of very recent studies showing that, the coast of California, Oregon, and Washington, there is a huge potential for offshore wind development. However, the transmission capacity is one of the main constraints, especially in the Washington and Oregon coast, because the main load centers are located, a few hundred miles from the coast. So we don't have a very good infrastructure capacity on the coast to transmit this huge amount of power. Is that something that we see, across the country, transmission capacity constraints?
Absolutely, yeah. I fully agree with you. There is a recent study by DOE that looks at the necessary transmission capacity across the U.S. It's publicly available. It's available in the DOE website. So those of in our audience who are interested, take a look at that. And yes, there is a significant need to build transmission lines to interconnect those areas of the country with the highest potential of wind and solar. So that's an important concern. I forgot to mention one that is very, very important. It's also non-technical. All of this that we are discussing is already quite complex, given all of those circumstances that I was mentioning. But on top of that, we don't have unlimited funding, right? Affordability is also a key concern. If we want to do this decarbonization and energy transition, somebody has to pay for those investments. So we need to have a conversation around that, and also around energy justice, to make sure that everybody enjoys the benefits from this energy transition, and also contributes to pay the bill, right? So that's another element.
Nice, very interesting. Let's talk a little bit about Brazil now. So Brazil's electricity mix is, very clean and renewable, but there is a lot of challenges. We have seen a lot of integration of wind and solar. And so, Luis, in your opinion, what are the main challenges to, further, decarbonize the power grid in Brazil right now?
That's a great question because, first of all, I fully agree with what Julio said about the US. So the challenges are pretty much the same everywhere, and it's no different in Brazil. But I think that the cool thing about Brazil is that besides being like 5 times world champion of soccer, Brazil is a clean energy powerhouse. So we are a world champion of clean energy, where our chief renewable technology, let me put it this way, is not blue, is not green actually, but it's blue, it's hydro. So hydropower is the dominant clean technology. And several of the hydro plants, they do have storage, which adds a lot of flexibility in the system, and creates a very interesting environment to integrate renewables. And as a whole, globally, about 75% of the emissions, they are caused by the energy industry. So in Brazil, about 75% of the emissions, they come from deforestation and agriculture. So the numbers are completely the other way around, which means that if you have a clean energy mix already today, so Brazil is today on the grid race for the low carbon economy, where many economies want to be in like 50 years. Okay, so if you have something that people want to have in the future today, the big challenge is how to use this clean energy mix to decarbonize the other sectors of the economy, including transportation, as well as to add value on low carbon products such as steel, iron, cement, and all the heavy industry that today still relies on liquid fuels in many parts of the world. So definitely, if Brazil does its homework, the country can really put itself as a clean energy powerhouse and be very, very well positioned in this energy transition thing, or energy transformation, which is how I have liked more to name it. So these are the good news. So the challenges, we have many. One interesting challenge is the fact that the flexibility of the hydropower, the hydro plants, which is crucial to integrate renewables, will be reducing over time. Why? Because of two things. First, because of the adverse effects of climate change impacts on inflows. So an interesting thing about Brazil, which is a challenge, is the fact that our cleanest technology, which is hydro, is very vulnerable to climate change. And this is coming, this is hitting not only Brazil, but other countries. So hydropower, this is going to be an issue. The second thing is the increasing number of social environmental constraints that are adversely affecting the ability of the hydros to deliver flexibility. So the actual flexibility that hydro plants can deliver over time, in my humble opinion, won't grow. We actually diminish over time because of the need to use the water for non-power use, which is something that is very popular, by the way, in the Western US, where you are, Josh, for example, without the BPA cascades and plants and so on, the Columbia River tree and etc. So this is going to be more and more of a reality to other countries. But Brazil does have an integrated system. So in terms of surface area, Brazil has 8.5 million square kilometers. This is equivalent to the continental US plus half of Alaska. And we have an integrated grid, so 200,000 kilometers of high voltage lines, which allows the country to operate as a portfolio of assets. So transmission integrates hydro plants in different hydro basins, wind plants and renewables in different places, which have a lot of correlation, a lot of complementarity in their production patterns. So on the generation side, what Brazil is doing is swapping power all the time from one region to the other, trying to optimize those complementarities. So we have a wind that blows at night, the Bohemian wind farms. We have a wind that blows in the day. We have the solar power, which is very correlated to air conditioning load growth, and so on. And the complementarity in the hydrological patterns gives the country a unique position to optimize all of that. The challenge is, of course, to push and to press the right buttons and to be very much aware of those new impacts of climate change, which is affecting, technologies in many different ways. But if we do our homework, if we can do the job, honestly, I think Brazil is very well positioned to, through its clean energy mix, decarbonize the others and become a very interesting player on other, novel areas such as sustainable aviation fuels, hydrogen, as Julio said before. There's a lot of things still to be explored. The country doesn't have renewable, as opposed to the US. Brazil doesn't have a renewable portfolio standards or renewable energy targets, anything like that. Everything is very much economically oriented. So there are renewable auctions. So whoever offers the lowest price gets a PPA. The market is a contract market. But still, I think that on the physical side is where Brazil has a very competitive advantage, because we are today where many countries would like to be in the case.
Right. Yeah, very interesting. So you mentioned about the El Nino, La Nina, and all this, challenges regarding hydro. So I remember when I was working for NREL, we led a study showing the challenges related to power system flexibility in Brazil. So we collected a lot of data from different El Nino and La Nina years, and we basically show the difference, and as you mentioned, Brazil has this interconnected system, so it can explore complementarity, especially the north area and the south area. So they have different rain patterns, and this is very, very interesting. So I have seen a lot of especially developments in wind power in the northeast area. However, I was also reading about some transmission, capacity issues and public opposition to transmission lines. Is that a big issue in Brazil?
No, yes, it is. Actually, an interesting thing is that Brazil has been having a very high level of renewables penetration, especially in the Northeast, where renewables have been in many hours over the past few years met 100% of the local load in the Northeast, plus exported. So if you take the numbers, you have some specific hours where renewables, they're meeting like 120, 140% of the local load of the region, which means that they're supplying everything plus exporting to other regions. The renewables in this area, they are very cool because their load factors are very high. So in terms of onshore wind, we're talking about load factors of 50% on average. So a bad wind farm has a load factor of 40, 45%, which those numbers, they are literally the double of the US. So very good resources, and the same thing applies for solar. Transmission is an issue, I think, everywhere. not only in Brazil. The story is pretty much, the same. What I'm going to tell you, I could just replace Brazil by US, Spain, Europe, whatever, and it would be applicable as well. But in the end of the day, like before, we use it to build transmission faster than generation. So in terms of planning, as Julio said, things were very easy. You decide on generation, then you do transmission. But over time, we became much more as what the US has been for many years, which is transmission is taking much longer than generation. So you take like from 5 to 7 years if you do things very well to do transmission. So first of all, there is one lack of coordination between generation and transmission planning, and the bulk of the difficulties they are on the permitting side. So permitting, again, the big headache that the US has. This little thing has come to Brazil, so the opposition on the rights of way and etc. etc. This is creating a lot of new complexities for the country. In addition of that, because now generation can be built much faster than transmission, and because renewables they just escalate from all over, especially solar as distributed generation, we're having the problems of the connection queues, pretty much as in the US, as in Europe, with a little difference. The Brazilian numbers, they are horrible as for today. So the queues are of 200 gigawatts or so, not considering storage. Okay, so I don't think that we have reached the deep trouble that some regions in the US have, because the queues in the US are super big because you consider solar, wind, and storage. So here, storage is something that is still coming little by little, but it will add and will compound to this complexity. There are many regulatory actions and mechanisms being taken to overcome this, such as to think of doing connections auctions, because if the connection is a scarce resource, why not auction the connection right? So there are many regulatory actions done this way, and many regulatory actions done to organize better the permitting issue, so that planning can become more effective and more transmission can be delivered. But at the same time, technically, there are many new challenges on the transmission planning side, because if distributed generation will grow, if batteries will come on the distributed side of the grid, the competition between transmission and distributed generation will be fierce. So we have to be very cautious not to overbuild transmission and then create tariff hikes which are not necessary. That's a very complicated problem all over. So should we just build transmission to integrate centralized generation, or should we just go more and more towards the belief that the DRs, the distributed energy resources, will be responsible for supplying, a very important portion of the load. So these are the challenges. Again, as I said before, these challenges, they are all over, everywhere. Same thing in the US, in Europe, and in Asia, and so on. But in Brazil, they are coming at a very fast pace, I would say.
Very, very interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. So once again, feel free to put your questions in the chat. So let's talk a little bit about grid modernization. So both countries are facing challenges related to aging infrastructure, and we see this in all sectors: generation, transmission, and distribution. So let's start talking about the US. So, Julio, we have seen a lot of research, especially in academic research, about microgrids, virtual power plants, demand response, and in this changing landscape of inverter-based resources, what are the main challenges related to power grid modernization in the US?
Yes, let me add just a little bit to the previous discussion before we move on. I think that something that Brazil has as an advantage with respect to the US or France is the same, I would say, is the fact that you already have clean energy technologies that use synchronous machines, right? So the fact that you have a significant inertia in your system coming from clean energy technologies, that's a really important advantage. In our case, we are replacing those old generation technologies like coal that rely on synchronous machines, have high inertia, but inverter-based technologies, and that is the challenge, right? And realistically, it's very difficult to build a hydropower plant in the U.S. These days. So that's not. I mean, we may build some in the future, but the majority of clean energy technologies that are available at this point are variable, low inertia solutions. That's why we need more modular nuclear that can be built quickly, and hydrogen and others. But now moving to the question on grid modernization. So let me make a clarification here. So technology is a very important element of grid modernization, and it's perhaps the shining object when we think about grid modernization, right? We think about automation, control, advanced protection, and that remains the core of grid modernization. And the integration of distributed resources, microgrids, virtual power plants, all of that's at the core of grid mod. But there are other elements that are also quite challenging. You mentioned one of them, aging infrastructure, right? So hardening the grid, weather hardening, because climate change is real and is affecting all of us. Luis mentioned, for instance, droughts. That's a very important issue if you have a system with high penetration of hydro. In the U.S.'s case, we have, of course, hurricanes in the Gulf Coast. We have wildfires, and wildfires are a very significant problem in the West Coast and other jurisdictions. We have winter storms like what happened in Texas a couple of years ago. So besides technology, we need to make that foundational infrastructure. We need to make it more robust, more resilient, more reliable. So we need to replace poles, wood poles, by steel or concrete poles. We need to do strategic undergrounding. We need to replace aging assets, all of that. So that's second component. Then we have another component that is related with applications, software solutions, and if we deploy technology, we're going to collect plenty of data. We're going to have the capability to operate the grid in real time. It's something that we do at transmission system level already, but it's not something that we do regularly in distribution, monitoring and control in real time. So we'll collect data that we need to process, so analytics, software solutions to process that data and to implement intelligent and optimal control actions. That's very important. That's an software applications layer. That would be third component, right? And we also have to think about innovation. That's another important component, because things are going to continue, becoming more and more dynamic and more complex. So we have that element as well, and I mentioned also human resources and other soft elements that are important. So in terms of challenges, or what is needed, is coordination to consider all of these different components. In some areas of the country, technology is the key challenge. The grid is relatively new and is resilient and is reliable, and perhaps not as significantly affected by climate change as other jurisdictions. So the focus may remain technology, but in others, it may require addressing everything together, right? And I forgot to mention one element that is it's involved in innovation, but that we need to keep in mind: modernizing planning approaches, system analysis, planning approaches. And Luis alluded to this in his previous comment. When we think about T&D, in the past, transmission and distribution were largely decoupled. So when we were doing planning in the past, distribution was basically a spot load connected to every bus of a transmission system model. Still today, that's generally the case. But if, as Luis mentioned, if we have more DER connected to the grid, more substations, distribution substations, injecting power to the sub-transmission and transmission system, which is a reality today, is something that is normal now. Then the interactions between transmission and distribution become more important. We need to pay attention to that. And when we do planning, we need to consider both together. So we are moving in that direction to do an integrated transmission and distribution planning. And then when we do IRP, in the past, IRP was basically based on bulk power system resources. Not anymore, because now we have DER as well. So in that IRP, we need to consider DER. So in reality, we're moving into this big big monster, if you want to call it that way, an integrated resource transmission and distribution planning. And that is something that we haven't done before. So that requires new methodologies for planning. It goes back to the point about innovation and developing new knowledge. So you can see it's a combination of factors. The specifics are dependent upon the features of every jurisdiction, every system. But you have to look at all of them in a coordinated fashion.
Very good, very interesting. So when we talk about grid modernization and planning, some people may think, oh, we're going to need a bunch of new transmission distribution lines. We're going to need more and more resources, more investments. But there is one very interesting area of research that, leverages all this data processing, and that is called non-wires alternatives. So instead of adding more, how can we better use what we already have, So what is the important for, this future solutions, non-wires alternatives, instead of adding and investing more resources?
That's an excellent point. And going back also to your previous question, so microgrids and virtual power plants, non-wires alternatives, demand response, etc. They are part of the solution, right? They are the way I see grid model is like you have a toolbox. You have several different tools, and you're going to use each one of them to some extent, depending again on the features of every power system. So non-wires alternative is certainly one of those solutions, and that's why we also need energy storage, long-term energy storage. So you can, through the joint application of technologies like solar, along with energy storage, basically you have firm capacity that you can use to address both transmission and distribution capacity needs, or the ability to regulate voltage, the ability to provide reactive power support when needed. So certainly NWA is one of those elements. Now, where I think that we need to be careful, and is in relying exclusively on NWA, right? And what I mean by that is that when you look at let's see, two kind of opposing views of this transition, the energy transition, how the grid is going to evolve. You look at, for instance, folks who say, well, yeah, distributed resources, yeah, they are important. Basically, we need to accommodate, we need to modernize the grid to accommodate them, but that's it. We need to continue relying on the grid and large generation stations, etc. So you have that position, and then you have the other view, which is no more wires. Everything is going to be distributed. Everything is going to be in a collection of microgrids interacting, all of that. I think that my personal opinion is that the truth is somewhere in between. We're going to have a hybrid grid. So yes, in some areas and in some applications where it is economically effective, where benefit cost analysis demonstrates that is feasible, and technical analysis as well. Most importantly, perhaps, technical analysis demonstrate that it's feasible. Yes, we use non-wires alternatives. In other areas, we are going to continue. You mentioned this a moment ago. We are still going to continue using wires. We need wires. We need transmission lines. Long transmission lines will continue being a need. So it's a combination of both. So again, it's part of the toolbox. I think that is part of the toolbox. We recently did an analysis on NWA for a large utility, and out of all the different feeders that we analyzed over, it was a couple of thousand feeders. The number of feeders where an NWA was economically feasible and technically feasible was small, was just a couple of dozens. Today, right? Of course, costs are going to change, and technology is going to get better. So that number is going to increase in the next few years, but it's going to be very specialized, and the same applies to microgrids. I think that nanogrids is probably a more a feasible short-term solution, and by nanogrids I mean customer-based microgrid, basically similar to what let's see Green Mountain Power is doing in the Northeast with the deployment of Tesla Powerwalls behind the meter. They are dispatching those for peak shaving applications, but they are also considering reliability improvement, basically as backup generation for a few hours. So I think that is something that we'll see more and more in the short and mid-term. And then the feeder-based or substation-based microgrid applications, that's going to take a little bit longer. We have those already in specialized applications, as I mentioned before, long distribution or transmission lines with important loads at the end of the line, and so you need to provide better service to those locations. Then that's what we do today. In the future, we'll see more of those, but it's going to take a little bit longer.
All right, thank you. That was very, very interesting explanation. Luis, let's talk a little bit about Brazil. What are the main challenges in Brazil? Are they pretty much the same, or are there some particular challenges in Brazil in this area?
No, I think that on the physical side, they are pretty much the same. I mean, what Julio brought, it's pretty much what's being discussed here as well. With, I think, just a small little difference, maybe if you can say it this way. First is distribution, I would say, is the most vulnerable grid. So, of course, we do have vulnerabilities on the high voltage grid as well, but the distribution grid is the one that needs to be taken care, I would say, faster and with a different perspective. Second thing, non-wire alternatives and so on. This is little by little we're merging here. The tricky thing about Brazil, which is very different from the US, is the fact that a distributed generation has a very generous subsidy. I mean, our net metering arrangement is super generous. And so in the end of the day, because of the subsidy, DG just spreads out. And if you take the subsidy out of the calculation, in some points of the grid, they may even be more competitive when compared to the grid itself. But that's a completely distorted comparison because the subsidies are being taken out of the calculation. So the subsidies in the grid in the distributed part of the grid is an issue, but the distribution grid, I would say, is the most vulnerable one. But what Julio didn't speak about, what I think it's the biggest challenge here in Brazil is regulation. Is regulation to deal with grid modernization, because the bulk of the regulation for transmission and distribution that we have here addresses very well, expansion, so new investments. But how to deal with aging, how to deal with equipment replacing, especially handling on the distribution side of the grid, equipment that will have a much shorter lifetime than what the classic equipment of today, has. So this is, I would say, the big challenge. The regulator here is trying to do the job, to run after and trying to get there, but still we have a long road ahead. I don't think that the regulation that we have today in place allows the grid modernization to happen at the pace that will be needed, especially on the distributed part of the grid. And Julio mentioned in the beginning his first, reply, first answer to you, Josh, about affordability. And those things, they cost money. So in the end of the day, if you want to put cables underground, which is an interesting thing against grid vulnerability, this is way more expensive, right, than having what we have all over, Latin America. So I would say these are the core topics. In addition to what Julio said, which is on the physical side, we're pretty much on the same page.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. So you mentioned the subsidies for DER. So in Brazil, is the subsidies are, decided at the federal level, or each utility or each state has freedom, to, develop new types of subsidies at a regional level?
Now, as opposed to the US, everything in Brazil is done at a federal level, which is good on the one hand. On the other hand, this has, in the end of the day, pushed a lot of the discussions to happen in Congress. And so Congress and the Senate, in many occasions, they have run over the institutional framework of the industry and deciding subsidies and voting in favor of lobbies here and there, which has been creating some sort of a snowball of subsidies here and there, because each segment is better off just fighting for its own right in Congress, not on the technical level, which does not help to have, a technically sound industry. So I would say that the subsidies, they are decided on the national level. The states, they can do some things on taxation, okay, but financially speaking, they don't have too much fiscal space to create a big mess on this. But it's at the federal level that things are decided. And what is happening here is that, unfortunately, for the past few years, a lot of the good technical discussion has been transferred to the Congress. I mean, to people that have absolutely no idea of what they are talking about. Not because they are bad people, it's because it's not their expertise, and they don't have, the deep knowledge needed to really regulate and legislate on complex things as subsidies for distributed generation, time of use tariffs, and so on. So this is a bad part of the game, but that has been happening not only in Brazil, but also in other countries, especially in Latin America. So the power that a congressman have been having on this has not been small in the end of the day. And that this is not good, because this weakens the regulator, weakens the planner, weakens the ministries, and so on. But they are decided, coming back to your original question, subsidies at the federal level.
Okay, sounds good. Julio, California was one of the first states in the US to develop a net metering program. They had like net metering 1.0, and then, people start talking about duck curve, and they develop net metering 2.0 and other mechanisms, gradually reducing the subsidies, and the incentives. And now people are talking about the canyon curve. And we have a lot of other states, looking at California, and there's lots of debates and discussions about incentives and subsidies. So how is the situation in the US? Are most of the states still offering incentives, subsidies, or they're not thinking too much about it now?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and yeah, let me get to that in a moment. I just wanted to thank Luis for mentioning regulation in the previous question, and I shouldn't have forgotten regulation. I was a regulator back in a few years ago in Honduras, and I remember I have a presentation on regulatory modernization, because I fully agree. Yeah, I fully agree with Luis about the need for addressing regulation and make it more consistent with what is happening on the physical side of things. Actually, in many cases, regulation, yes, as he mentioned, is it's an obstacle, or it's not aligned with what is happening today. I'll give you a very specific example. In some jurisdictions, energy storage is considered as a generation technology, and certainly, I mean, there is some truth to that. But the issue with that is that some utilities in those jurisdictions are prevented from owning generation So that means that they cannot own energy storage, which prevents them from addressing some issues that energy storage can solve in the grid that are not related with generation at all, right? So that's just one example. And the challenge is also that the pace of change in regulation is way slower than in the technology side of things. So it's a problem, certainly. Now, going to your question, in the US, it varies. We have that federal system, as I said, every state operates almost like an independent country sometimes. So subsidies vary from state to state. Now, I want to contrast two points of view about that: California versus Texas, right? Um, in California, the energy transition was driven by the government, right, by the local state government through legislation, basically through RPS, energy storage mandates. So it's kind of centralized, and then utilities and all industry stakeholders basically follow that guideline, and there are some incentives, as you mentioned, in place. And they have been effective in the sense that there has been an increasing adoption of renewables and distributed resources, and the Canyon curve, as you said, is real. This March, I think that it was the first time that when you look at the California ISO data, and you look at net load, the way they calculate it, I think it was in March of this year, March or April, it was the first time that that Canyon curve went negative. Basically, the system, from a net load point of view, became an exporting system, and then the ramp rates are amazingly, high, which represents a challenge from the point of view of load following. We not all generation technologies have that capability to follow load as fast as it's going to be needed in the future. So there is certainly a challenge there. But when I said that it was successful, is yes, that adoption happened, and through the adoption, prices started decreasing quickly. So when you look at solar generation prices today versus 10 or 20 years ago, there has been a significant decrease, and also the same applies to energy storage, and it was a consequence to some extent of that decision that the state made. Okay, we are going to transition in this direction, the energy storage, the energy transition, right? Clean energy transition. Now, other states have enjoyed or are enjoying the benefits from that price decline. So Texas is one of them. Texas, their approach has always been market driven, right? So if this make economic sense, there are some. Texas also has an RPS, but it was achieved a few years ago, mainly through adoption of wind, utility scale wind generation, because at the time that was the technology that was cost effective. It became more cost effective. Yeah, it became cost effective faster than solar, right? So Texas adopted a lot of wind, and more recently, there has been an increasing adoption of solar because now prices have gone down. But that is also a consequence, to some extent, of the decision, the government-driven decision that California took a few years ago. So it's an interesting contrast, just to explain how in the U.S. you have states that yes have incentives, others do not have incentives. And at the end, we are kind of converging in the same direction at different paces, of course.
Very, very interesting. Yeah, that's a real challenge. So regarding grid modernization, let's talk a little bit about resilience. So we have seen the increasing number of high impact, low probability events, in both countries, Brazil and the United States. So historically, grid operators, they, try to incorporate reliability studies, indices in their studies. And now we have seen a lot of natural disasters impacting both grids. So last week, I think it was this week in Brazil, in São Paulo, thousands of customers without powers for many hours, for days. Luis, what are the main challenges regarding resilience in Brazil? What are the main types of natural disasters affecting power systems in Brazil?
No, I think these are, I mean, Julio has addressed this, I think, in a global fashion, and I fully agree that, excess of rainfalls, even sandstorms that we're having, just had a sandstorm in Manaus just recently, which is something very odd for Brazil, but mostly, excess of rain, high temperatures, and excess winds and so on. These are the classic events. But you mentioned resilience, and resilience has become a very popular word because people think that if we plan incorporating resilience, we'll be doing the job. But to be quite frank with you, I don't know if Julio will agree with me and you, Josh, as well. I find it very hard to precisely define what resilience is because if you design a system against the worst winds, the worst sun, the worst rainfall, the worst everything combined all together is going to just be super expensive, right? So, in the end of the day, I still haven't found a clear definition on how to represent, how to model resilience. And what concerns me the most, Josh, on protecting systems, on giving systems resilience, is the lack of information on data. I don't think that I will still have a comprehensive overview of how bad those climate events can be, or how good some of them can be as well. I think that we should incorporate, planning with uncertainty, with some sort of robust optimization technique. But we should be very cautious not to use resilience as a way to justify any type of investment, because otherwise the affordability dimension just gets, completely screwed. In the events that you said that we had last week in São Paulo, they were really massive. So in the same way that Mexico had in Acapulco just a few weeks ago, like a thunderstorm that in a matter of just a few hours transformed itself into a massive and dangerous hurricane that had destroyed Acapulco. In São Paulo, the wind forecast is in the metropolitan city of São Paulo was for winds of 55 kilometers per hour, like 2 hours ahead. But those winds, they materialized at 115 kilometers per hour. So basically, 2,000 trees collapsed. There were massive blackouts. The call center of the distribution utility usually handles 50,000 calls per day. They had to handle 2.5 million calls per day during those events. So this is something that there is no distribution company that can be prepared for that ever. If we're gonna have this cost structure in place, we have to do the math and to see what's going to be the impact on the tariff in the end of the day. Of course, Brazil has its own problems, such as, for example, we don't have a highly developed underground network of cables. The cables, they are very exposed, which increases the vulnerability. But in order to not make myself just too long, I just come back to what Julio said. Natural events, they are pretty much the same everywhere, and they are getting the same literally everywhere. This word is becoming very strange, but we have to be very cautious on what we mean by resilience. Otherwise, just hiding ourselves against resilience will be able to justify, any investment. And I don't think it's like this that we should at least plan and regulate our energy industry.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Luis. It's hard to quantify the risk. If we are able to quantify the risk, we can incorporate this risk assessment in the planning tools. However, it's without data, this is almost impossible. Julio, very quickly. So US is huge. We have wildfires on the west, hurricanes in the East Coast. So how to balance, all these different types of disasters and grid planning approaches?
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with Luis's comments. I think that we need to do also a better job communicating expectations to end users, to customers, and also to decision makers, to regulators. So when we make investments in resilience, as Luis mentioned, we cannot, I mean, nobody should expect no interruptions. Going back to a Category 5 hurricane, yeah, you can harden the grid, you can modernize the grid, but guess what? There will be interruptions, and it's going to be there are going to be long duration interruptions after a Category 5 hurricane, unless you spend billions of dollars undergrounding everything, and which is not it's not affordable. So it's important to communicate that message to regulators, to policymakers, and also to end users, and to find a reasonable balance. So these events, these black swan type of events, low probability or low frequency and high impact events, in the past were truly black swans. Today and increasingly in the future, they are going to become more common. So yeah, it is important. We need to prepare for them, but within reason, right? Within reason, because the cost of, I'll give an example, the example of Texas with Winter Storm Uri. The cost of having the majority of the grid in Texas without power for days. I was impacted by one of them. I live in Houston. I live in the Uptown area of Houston, the financial district, and I was without power for 3 days in the energy capital of the world, right? So the cost of that type of event is significant. We need to quantify it, and we need to make a decision. Are we willing to experience this type of event periodically, or are we willing to make investments to not to avoid it completely, because again, that would be extremely expensive, to minimize the disruption, right? To something that we agree that is more reasonable. And there are concepts like, okay, instead of designing a grid that is going to fail catastrophically against when one of those events happen, let's try to design a grid that is going to fail gracefully when one of those events happen, and that we are going to be able to restore faster. And that second solution is going to be certainly less expensive than the first one, right? I'm sorry, it's going to be less expensive than the first one, because the cost of not having power for 3 days, the human cost of that can be major, right? There are documented, I think that, I'm trying to remember the number of deaths during Winter Storm Uri, but it was over 100. Some people say that even more than that. So we need to keep that in mind. So it's a balance at the end. And to your point, every jurisdiction has specific events that have priority: wildfires in the West Coast, hurricanes in the Gulf Coast. Although this year, California was impacted by a tropical storm, one of the first times in their history, right? So things are changing, so, which makes things more challenging.
All right, that's it's complex. Yeah, especially for large countries like Brazil and the United States. Well, time flies. It was a very nice discussion. It was a very pleasant discussion. I want to thank you both for your time and for your, opening this time in your busy schedules. Thank you so much for, this great discussion. And this is very important for our students who are interested in working in the power industry, and they are aware of these challenges. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise and for this great discussion. Yeah.
Thank you. Always a pleasure chatting with you guys, and thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, it was very good. And I think that as a final message, the US and Brazil, they have a lot of in common and a lot to collaborate. I think that on the human resources, on capacity building, I think there's a lot of things we can do together. Also on technologies, sustainable aviation fuels, nuclear, offshore wind, and everything else. So fortunately, these are two countries with a very long and good relationship that we should just take it, to another level, using the energy industry as a platform. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Josh.
Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, and bye-bye.